This is second lecture for Friday, March 27th. We're continuing on with this topic of community ecology, and we've gotten to the point where we're looking at diversity within communities. That's what's going to be basically the rest of this topics that are covered in community ecology. So first of all, in terms of interactions that are taking place within a community, you've got a bunch of different populations, a bunch of different species that are interacting with each other. Same place, same time. And so we looked at these different characteristics of populations, that there's a certain number of males, there's a certain number of females, they reproduce a certain way, they're in a certain habitat with a certain amount of water and oxygen and food and all these different things. Well, in addition to individual populations doing whatever they're doing, those individual populations are interacting. We've looked at three major ways that species interact. They compete with one another. They eat one another. They have symbiotic relationships with one another. So those are the type of interactions that take place within a community. And as time goes on and these interactions are developing over long periods of time, then these communities develop. And these communities have different levels of diversity. Sometimes the communities become quite stable, and you've got all these different species that interact in all these different ways, and it doesn't change that much. Some communities revolve around disturbance, where these communities develop up to a point, there's some kind of a disturbance, a fire, a big wave, a tidal wave or something, and then the community development starts over again. We'll look at that later, but to begin with, there's a certain type of diversity within a community. And a simple way, very simple way, well, relatively simple, of looking at whether a community is diverse compared to another community is just by looking at the number of species. That's pretty easy. And we're going to see that's one metric of looking at diversity within a community. But just like populations, when we looked at populations, if you recall, there were two main features about populations. There was abundance and there was a distribution of populations. Well, populations have structures, certain size, a certain number of males, a certain number of females, a certain proportion of pregnant females, mature females, all these different characteristics that are unique to each population. The same is true for communities. Each community has a certain type of structure, certain traits, certain properties. And there's two main things that one could look at in terms of a community. This community is like this, and it's got these certain properties. One of those properties is abundance. Or in other words, how many individuals there are, how many different species there are, actual numbers. The second one, so that's fairly straightforward. Second one is a lot harder to put your finger on, and we're going to spend some time looking at how you might define diversity. Different people have come up with different explanations that they like or don't like and come up with their own. Let's start with this abundance, first of all. Well, what is the abundance of species within a community? Well, there's two different things mainly. There are the number of species. There's 100 species in this community. There's 200 species in this community, or there's 50 species community. Those are three different numbers of species you find in communities. Each one of those species, though, has a certain number of individuals or a certain population size. So we saw the challenges of quantifying population size when we were talking about population ecology, that it takes a certain amount of effort, quite a bit of effort sometimes, to estimate the number of individuals within a population. So if it's hard to do that for one species, you can imagine how hard it is to do that for 150 species that are in a community. It's very difficult, very impractical to even set out to do. People try and estimate the abundance of different populations, and there's different ways you can go about this. You can actually try and come up with these numbers, which I said is very difficult to do. You can use the methods that we looked at before. You can count individuals, you can do subsamples, you can try and do mark and recapture. But again, we saw that it's difficult to do this for one species. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to do for every species in a community. Some of these communities have thousands of species. So are you really going to be able to go out there and count the number of individuals within 1,000 different species? Are you even going to be able to estimate those? No, it would take a long, long time. But if you want to come up with some abundance estimate for some of the main species, maybe the top 5 or top 10, maybe even 20 if you're ambitious, then you can not do this one species at a time, but you can do this multiple species at once. So you're taking an area, you're throwing a grid down on the soil or on the grass or in the leaves, and you're counting not just the number of individuals within one species, but you're counting all the different organisms that you find there. And you say, oh, there's 20 species of this, 20 individuals of this species of insect. There's 17 individuals of this species. So you're doing this all at once. Or maybe you're swimming along a coral reef, along a transect, and you're counting the number of parrotfish and the number of wrasses and the number of damselfish and the number of butterfly fish. So you can do this in a similar way that you're doing subsamples of an individual species, like you're counting the number of robins. But in this case, you're counting the number of robins, the number of blue jays, the number of cardinals, the number of finches, the number of chickadees, all these different species at once. So you can get a relative abundance of each species in these areas. You don't have to count all of them, but you can get an idea of who is most important, who has the greatest numbers. And if you do these kind of things, you look at a number of different species, then what you find is that in some cases there's one species that's really, really dominant. And if you looked at 100 different individuals of a whole bunch of different species, that 90 of those might be the same species. 10 are mixed amongst the other species that are there. But what you typically find is that most species have an intermediate number. There's not very many that are really, really abundant or have really, really high populations. There's not very many that have low numbers. But the majority of species, if you went out and counted, let's say that you found 20 different species in the grass or in the leaves someplace, that most of those would have some kind of intermediate level of abundance. There'd be quite a few of them, but not a huge amount and not very few. It wouldn't be a tiny little number. That's what you typically find. And again, remember the challenge for doing this is in multiple species. Not just one, but you've got 100 species in this community. So you may not be able to count all the individuals, and an easier way of doing this would be having a relative abundance. So you go out and you find 1,000 different living things. Well, how many of those are this species, species A, and how many of those are species B and species C and species D, and all the way down your list as far as you can go. So let's say that you're able to do that. You're able to get an idea of how many different species there are, first of all, which is easier than counting the number of individuals of each species. But let's say that you're able to come up with some estimate of how many individuals there are of these different species. So what the population size is of different species. Those are two ways of looking at diversity. One of them is as simple as counting the number of species, which may not even be very easy to do. But there's these two main aspects of diversity. People have used these to different degrees to try and come up with some index of diversity that can be applied to a community and that can be used to compare communities. So we're going to look at these two different things. First of all, species richness is really just the number of species. If you went out and plopped your little quadrant down onto some grass or onto the leaves, and you counted all the different species you find, a certain number of insects, a certain number of worms, different animal groups, you could count the number of species. Or maybe you're going out in the woods and you're counting the number of trees, the number of plant species, something like that. Or you're on a coral reef and you're counting the different number of species. Or you're looking at an individual tree and you're counting the number of species you find on a typical tree in this woodland community. You can come up with an estimate of the number of species. Not always easy to do, but it's as straightforward as that there's 141 species in this community. There's 1,040 species in this community. Or it's a relatively simple community, not that much energy, not that many habitats to occupy. There's 21 species in this community. Something like that. Pretty straightforward. Species richness. Another way of looking at diversity within a community is not just counting the number of species, but trying to come up with an estimate of the relative abundance of each species. So for species A, there's 1,000 of them. For species B, there's 900 of those. For species C, there's 700 of those. For species D, there's 300 of those. And on you go down the list as far as you can go in a practical way to estimate the population size for each one of your species that's in this community. You can compare those and get an idea of species evenness. So do you have one species that's really, really abundant and you've got 99 species that are rare? Or do you have 20 species that have a relative population size that's similar? There's 100 of these 20 different species, and then it starts to drop off. You can get an idea of how diverse a community is by looking at species evenness. So it's a combination. This is what we're going to see for a lot of these indices. It's a combination of the number of species and the number of individuals that makes up each one of those species. And as I said, people have come up with different indices, and somebody's, well, I don't like this, let's change this, or I don't like this, this is what we're looking at. So people are trying to describe how diverse different communities are. That's their ultimate goal. But they're doing it different ways with different equations. We're going to see these different equations with math in there. We're not going to get focused on that math. If you ever had to do this, you could look this up yourself and you could find this equation. You could plug what you need to into the equation to figure out, to come up with some number. So we don't need to do that, other than to point out what these different indices are that you might use somewhere down the road if you were actually looking at species diversity in communities, as some of you might do in the future. Well, let's ask this question. Why are ecologists, or people generally, interested in diversity? We ask the same thing, I know, about populations. Why are people interested in population ecology? And there was a lot of interest about conserving species that are endangered or threatened. There's a lot of interest about pests and a number of different reasons why we're interested in populations. And I made the argument that, based on my experience anyway, with students that take ecology, it seems like populations are what more students are interested in than the other aspects of ecology. But there's certainly a lot of students that are interested in community ecology. There's a lot of ecologists that are interested in diversity. And community ecologists in particular, one of the things that they spend a lot of time working on is diversity within communities. So look, here's a list of different reasons why an ecologist, or humans in general, are interested in diversity within communities. And these are some of the reasons why we're going to spend the time that we do talking about diversity, looking at these different equations for measuring diversity. You know, you might look at this and say, oh, well, here's this one equation, here's another equation. Well, what are these people doing? Why don't they just say this community is diverse and this one isn't? Why are they spending so much time and putting so much effort into trying to come up with a better index of diversity? Well, these are some reasons why there's so much interest. Another thing to look at before we start looking at some of these equations is what are they actually trying to do? What are they trying to quantify? So in other words, what is a diverse community? What does that mean? You know, here at URI and other universities, it's harder to tell right now because everybody's at home. But, you know, there's statements about diversity, how diverse URI is, how diverse we are at this place. So we've all got an idea of diversity in terms of humans and society. But what does that mean in a community? Well, somebody might say, you know what diversity is to me? Diversity means a number of species. It's easy to do, and it reflects the complexity of a lot of communities. So let's just keep it simple and call diversity the number of species. We saw that with species richness. Other people would say, no, that's not, there's a lot more to it than that. Let's call diversity a combination of the different number of species and how abundant each one of those species is. And so we'll call that evenness. Let's say you have 100 species. The most even community that there could be is if you've got 100 species, there's 1,000 individuals of all 100 species. You can't get any more even than that. An uneven community, and maybe one that's not so diverse, would be one where there's 1,000 species, but one of those species, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, are really, really abundant. There's a huge population of 5 of those, but then you've got 995 species that don't have very many members of their population. So there's a couple that are very diverse, very abundant, and most of them not very abundant. Now, that's not a very even community, and so people would say that's not a very diverse community. Other ways are similar to that, looking at the dominance. We'll look at an equation that tries to demonstrate how dominance can be used to illustrate whether a community is diverse or not. And then we'll look at some uncertainty where it's basically based on, if you went out in a community and you just chose something at random. Look, I found something that's crawling along, what is that? See what species it is, see how many of those are, and what are the odds that the next individual that you pick up is going to be this species of worm, or this species of ant, or this species of insect. So uncertainty indices. People have developed a number of those, we'll see, that they think are useful in determining what species richness is, species diversity, community diversity. And then there's similarity indices. So it's a different approach, not coming up with some number. Oh, the species diversity, 2.3. What does that mean? Doesn't mean anything by itself. But this community has a species diversity of 2.3. This one has a species diversity of 1.7. So if you compare them with each other, 2.3 is obviously higher than 1.7. This community is more diverse than that one. So there's similarity indices or different indices. And so then you can relate one community to another. You can even relate the same community to itself over time. Has the impacts of humans. There was pollution, or there's some degradation, there's some event that occurred. How did that affect the diversity of this community? So you're looking at the same community over time. And then you can compare the diversity index of this same community, the woods across the street from URI in 1974, 1984, 94, 2004, 2024. You can compare a community with itself. So that is what we're going to look at when we go through these different diversity indices. And that's what we're going to start on Monday, March 30th. In our first video lecture, we'll be talking about diversity indices. So these two lectures together, they're less than 50 minutes. You can spend as much time as you want on these. You can pause the videos. You can watch them again if you want to. You can watch them whenever you want. That's the thought behind presenting these in video lectures, is that everybody will have access to these. You can access them whenever you want in two different pieces, two shorter pieces. You can, if you're limited to accessing all this online material on your phone, which supposedly a few people are, you don't have a computer, or there's only one computer in your house and you have to fight for the time to use it, those kind of things. With these YouTube videos divided into two, that'll give you a lot of flexibility for accessing this information. But ultimately, we want to go through as much material in this course as possible and make it as much like the experience that we would have had in person. Of course, it's going to be different, but as much like that, especially in terms of what you learn.